Before I could start painting the interior, all of the parts needed to be prepped and primed first. So I started off by cutting all of the sprues from the parts. Firstly, the new door cards from USCP were released from that big block, that is the sprue from molding. That was quickly snapped through after a small slice from the Wonder Cutter, and all the other parts were quickly cut out of the sprues as well with a flush cut plier. Some of the parts still had some of the parts from the sprues on there, which needed to be cut off with the pliers, and some of the mold lines firstly were removed with a knife. These are a bit more of a flash than actual mold line, so that was just easily cut off, and then the mold line itself was scraped and sanded smooth. On the backside of the headrests for the seats, there were a couple holes in there. I'm not sure if they're supposed to be there or not. I simply didn't like the look of them, so I filled them up with some light curing putty, cured that with a UV flashlight. It cures in a matter of seconds, and then sanded it smooth for all the holes to be filled up, of course, and could then move on to sanding all the other parts that needed it with a 600 grit and moving on to primer. So once all of the parts were prepped and ready, I moved them into the spray booth, applied a couple light coats of Tamiya gray primer, and then moved on to applying the main color. For the dashboard and other plastic pieces, I decided to mix some flat black with a bit of the primer to tone it down and not make it as dark of a black, but more of a dark gray. As I've seen on some reference photos from these actual cars, they are not fully black, but are kind of a gray, maybe a navy gray or something like that, but not full black. So mixing that up is just simply leaving some of the primer in after applying it and adding the black. I don't have a specific mixture, as I just kind of did it by feel and then painted all the parts with 1 or 2 coats until they were nicely covered. Now that all the plastic or vinyl pieces have received their main color, it was time to let that cure for a bit and then move on to masking. After the masking was completed, it was time to move back into the spray booth and add another custom mixture. This time again primer and black, but focusing mainly on the primer gray color and adding some black to it to tone it down a bit and make it a bit darker, but still remain with that gray color. Some of the photos I've seen online from the standard interiors for these Civics just had a darker gray cloth interior, so I decided to go with that. I found some reference material on the website from Craig Lieberman. He was the creative producer, or at least he had something to do with all of these movie cars in the first couple of movies, and he was pretty much responsible for most of the parts on them, so he does know a lot about these. And on his website it says that the interiors were pretty much untouched and had a stock DX interior, and some of them are the EX, which means they have a sunroof as well. So I just stuck to some of the standard interiors I found online and went with that darker gray for the plastic and the lighter gray for the cloth. In keeping with that stock interior, I decided to go with a gray carpet as well, laying down a nice thick layer of semi-gloss clear acting as a glue, and then adding the USCP gray flocking on top of it, letting it dry, removing the bulk material, and moving on to the next section of floor, which need to have some carpet. Once that was completed, I could move on to adding additional details on some of the door panels and the other interior pieces with some additional black and also some silver to highlight a couple other pieces. After completing all of the black areas, some pieces on the seats needed to have a dark gray as a contrasting plastic to the cloth, which was applied simply with a brush as well. Once that was completed, I moved on to a super small tiny detail brush and added some silver dots to a couple of the buttons just to give the dashboard a bit more life and realism. On the entire interior, there is basically just one decal, and that is for the gauges. So after applying that, letting it cure, I could move on to adding some more custom details like seat belts. I'm just going to glue these to the door panels and the rear seats. I'm not really using some seatbelt buckles, as the interior will mainly pretty much be hidden in its entirety after all of the windows have been tinted to their dark limo tint at a later stage in the build. Once those were all glued in, I could move on to assembling the dashboard, the center console, and the entire interior eventually as well. While putting on the second door card, the seatbelt that I glued on earlier popped off, so that needed to be repositioned and re-glued. But firstly, I wanted to make sure that the door card was in place properly, and then just gently put it back in place, and that finishes off the interior. So overall, as you can see, the interior isn't really anything special or to speak of. It is just a stock Honda Civic interior. I tried matching all of the colors as closely as I could to some of the reference material, and by adding a couple details here and there to liven it up a bit. Now in the end, as I mentioned earlier, the entire interior will pretty much be hidden behind some of the smoked glass with a limo tint, as the original movie cars had too. So again, it is just a nice detail to have on the inside, but not something I really wanted to focus on truly and go overboard with a lot of details. I just stuck with what I had and the great upgrade parts that were already there from USCP and finished it off nicely. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.